Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today, either in person or online. My name is Zach Parrish. I'm the programming librarian here at the Bexley Public Library. So before we get started, I just want to give a big thank you to Jason Craybill and Judy Oppenheimer from the Decorative Arts Center of Ohio. They've really put together this wonderful series with us at the library that allows us to bring in curators with their recent exhibitions at the museum, and we get to learn a little bit about their work as curators and the exhibition. It's just a wonderful partnership. So we very much appreciate working with Judith and Jason on this series. And I want to also steer you to a couple other food-related programs that we have coming up. We're doing a Taste of the Bexley Farmers Market with Abby Turner from Common Greens on Thursday, October 23rd at 5 p.m. at the Bexley Farmers Market. So join us at the market at 5 o'clock. Abby will kind of give us a behind-the-scenes look at what goes into planning and organizing a farmer's market, and then we'll have a taste testing of some recipes from with some ingredients from the vendors. And then we'll be back here for Food for Thought, Food in American Art and Culture, which is another Decorative Arts Center of Ohio Curator Series talk, and we'll be joined by a couple curators from the Canton Museum of Art to exhibit or to look at their collection and part of the current exhibition going on at the Decorative Arts Center. Today, we are very excited to be joined by the curators for the current exhibition, Essential Ingredients, Cookbooks as History, which is currently on display at the Decorative Arts Center of Ohio through January 4th. So if you haven't made it yet, please visit the Decorative Arts Center and take a look at the exhibition. And we're very happy to be joined by two wonderful curators. The first, Jolie Braun, is the curator of modern literature and manuscripts in the Ohio State University's Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, where she manages and develops the modern literature and history collections and provides special collections-based instruction. And then we're also joined by Elizabeth Hewitt, who is a professor and chair of the Ohio State University Department of English. Hewitt holds a PhD and an MA from Johns Hopkins University and a bachelor's degree from Amherst College. Her expertise spans pre-1900s American and African American literature, the intersection of economics and literature, and popular culture. She is currently researching the long history of science fiction, focusing on utopian fictions and experiments in 19th century US. Please join me in welcoming Jolie and Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Jolie.
I'm Beth.
And again, thank you so much for coming out today on this beautiful Sunday afternoon and spending some time with us. We're going to do a couple different things today. So just an agenda of what to expect. We will start by telling you a little bit about the sort of inspiration and motivation for this exhibit. We'll tell you about what you'll see if you're able to get over to the Decorative Arts Center and see it in person. So we'll go kind of topic by topic. And with each topic, we'll highlight maybe a couple items per case. So you can get a sense of like what to expect, and hopefully will whet your appetite to explore further. Okay, so I'm gonna start by telling you a little bit about why we decided to have a cookbook exhibit. Do you have the clicker?
Yeah, I do have the clicker.
Do you want to just...
It's down, I think.
Or up.
Just do it with little things?
So it's a laser.
Great. So a little bit about why a cookbook exhibit. So first and foremost, as you just heard, I work at the Thompson Library's Rare Books and Manuscripts Library. So I'm a curator there and get to oversee our amazing cookbook collection. We are up to almost 9,700 volumes, nearly 10,000. So we have the largest collection of cookbooks in Ohio and one of the largest in the Midwest. This is a really significant and really amazing resource, but most folks don't know about it. I've spent the last several years teaching with it, helping researchers use it. I've always loved cookbooks, but working with it over and over the last several years just made me fall more in love and want to kind of share it with a wider audience. So this was kind of the starting point. Beth. I roped Beth in because I knew she also loved cookbooks.
I also love cookbooks. I had not done research in cookbooks, but I've been interested in domestic arts and the history of domestic arts, and I just personally love cookbooks. And so when I found out that there was a huge exhibit, Jolie and I started to talk, and eventually we both said, wouldn't it be great if we could actually showcase not only the collection, but also let people know that we have this remarkable archive of materials that people don't even know exists, which is often the case at Ohio State University, I think. There are all sorts of treasures that no one knows about. So we started thinking about the exhibit and kind of trying to make sense of how we would bring some sort of cohesion to it. I think the strength of the collection is American cookbooks published in the United States. So we kind of immediately or kind of early on decided that would be where we would lie. And one of the things when you do an exhibit is you try to come up with a title. We had the darndest time coming up with a title. We just could not come up with anything. And then kind of remarkably, Jolie found this citation or quotation.
It was hidden in plain sight all along. I had been using it for like the last several years, showing it to classes when they would come in and use the cookbooks during our instructional sessions. So it was there all along, and I realized it really perfectly captured what we were interested in about cookbooks and thinking about cookbooks as historical objects that can tell stories at a national level, global level, but also local communities and personal stories as well.
Yeah, that was really, we actually, I think if I'm remembering correctly, it was the preservation, this word here, the preserving, that really, we had actually been thinking about trying to incorporate that word into the title. And then, no, you're fine. And then all of a sudden, Child gave it to us. And that was really, I think for both of us, what we were most interested in about cookbooks is the ways in which they told different kinds of histories about different kinds of groups or individuals, whether or not nations or communities, a religious group, an ethnic group, a church or a synagogue, or individual families.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, so this was kind of our starting point, and we're going to go through the cases. There's 8 total, and we're gonna start at the beginning, which is iconic cookbooks. And the idea with this particular case and topic was, as you can see, we really wanted to welcome folks in with cookbooks that might be familiar. So we have a Betty Crocker, we have Julia Child's cookbook, but we wanted to place those alongside really significant but maybe lesser known works as well, and show you kind of like the full range. So you'll see Frida de Knight's, like, let's see, Date with a Dish, and Lydia Maria Child's American Frugal Housewife. So you see more than 200 years of cookbook history in this single case. And we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. So we're going to show you a few particular examples from this case. We have more than I think any other case examples, because this is one of our favorites, and we have a few that are just fantastic. This item you're seeing here, American Cookery, is the single oldest item in the exhibit. It is the oldest American cookbook. It's actually considered the first American cookbook for a few different reasons. It was the first written by someone who had been born in the colonies. While there had been cookbooks in the US before that time, they were mostly British reprints, or they were written by people who weren't from North America. So this was pretty significant. And then the other thing that kind of identifies this as a really significant moment in American cookbook history is it's the first appearance of indigenous ingredients. So squash, cranberries, cornmeal, things that are available in North America. A lot of the British reprints had featured, as you can imagine, ingredients that maybe weren't readily available or part of American cooking. So they weren't quite specifically for the audience that was actually using them. So the woman who wrote this, Amelia Simmons, kind of thought about that a little more and to be perfectly candid, there's also a lot of British recipes that shows that heritage that we have of British cooking, but she's also trying to think about something new and different, and using the ingredients that are available. And one thing I will point out about this title page that I really love, you see it's kind of crazy. There's a lot to take in, but if you look down past cakes, it says from imperial plum cake to plain cake. So it's saying, from fancy, elaborate, grand, to plain, simple, modest, inexpensive meals, adapted to this country and for all grades of life. And I just love that, and I point that out because I think we often just think of cookbooks as collections of recipes, and we're seeing, even at the very beginning, cookbooks are so much more. So we see really a sort of argument and a democratic project here, right? Those British reprints were for grand households often and for wealthy estates. This cookbook is actually for more ordinary households, more normal people.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a historically a really significant cookbook for that reason, because most English language cookbooks were, as Jolie just said, designed for servant staff, a housekeeper who could read and then give instructions to cleaners and housers in these big mansions. And this cookbook was not organized that way. The understanding was that even smaller households without servant staffs, what we now would call middle class, could use a cookbook to make recipes.
So we have 2 more items to show you of iconic cookbooks. And the first one I will talk about, and then Beth will talk about Moosewood. So as you see here on our left, The Joy of Cooking by Irma Rambauer. This might look a little less familiar than that iconic cover. I'm guessing many of you have seen The Joy of Cooking with that red J. So this is the first edition that looks quite different. The story of how this cookbook came to be is strange and fascinating. So I'll tell you just a little bit. Irma Rambauer was a homemaker in St. Louis in the 1950s when her husband unexpectedly passed away. She was suddenly kind of in the predicament of trying to figure out how she was going to have an income. She just had a $3,000 left that he had left her, and sort of as a surprise to everyone who knew her, she decided to write a cookbook. This was a bit of a surprise because Rambauer wasn't known as a cook. She was known as a great hostess, but she decided to write a cookbook. And she pulled recipes from neighbors, friends, honestly, other cookbooks, a lot of different sources, and used her last remaining funds that she had to self-publish this cookbook. As you know, it was a huge success. Her entire run of 3,000 copies sold out, and then the second edition was picked up by Bobbs Merrill, so a more mainstream publisher, and then you kind of know a little bit more of the history from there. It's never been out of print. This really wonderful cover you see was done by her daughter Marion, who, if you might have 1970s editions of The Joy of Cooking or some earlier edition from the mid-20th century. Marion, her daughter, actually took over The Joy of Cooking. So that name might be familiar to you. After Irma passed away, she kind of carried on the mantle. But before that, she went to art school. And that is how she ended up doing the decoupage that's on the cover. What you see here is Saint Martha, the patron saint of cooks, slaying the dragon of cooking. So you kind of get a little bit of an insight of what to expect before you even open and look at the contents. It's a slightly unconventional book, but it has Rambauer's voice and sense of humor. And that's one of the things that kind of marked it as so distinct and unique from other cookbooks like Betty Crocker, or things that were sort of more authoritative, but perhaps less friendly and accessible. So I encourage you to make sure to check this out. This is one of the coolest books we have, I think.
It is. The Moosewood, the Moosewood cookbook, how many of you, I came of age in the late 80s and the 90s, so the 2 cookbooks that I remember is my mom's Betty Crocker and Settlement cookbook, and then Moosewood, which I got. the reason I wanted to just show it to you is because we are lucky enough in the collection to have the original edition. The original edition, as you probably know, it comes from the Moosewood Restaurant, which was in Ithaca, New York. And it gets published if you have an early edition, its first publication is sort of 1977, but in 1974, the restaurant actually published a kind of self-published edition that literally had a kind of spiral bound. Later we'll talk about the community cookbooks, and in some sense it has a kind of do-it-yourself feel to it, and it then became, I think, one of the most iconic cookbooks, especially vegetarian cookbooks in the United States. Anyway, that you get to see that in the show, which is a treat. There are not a lot of them because they were self-published. So the next case, and I'll just show you what it looks like, was actually a genre of cookbook or subgenre of cookbook that I didn't know existed, which was that groups of community groups that were dedicated to either social causes or economic causes, political causes, would produce cookbooks as fundraisers for their cause. You can actually, I can kind of outline. I'm going to talk more about the suffrage one. I'm looking to see which one. Oh, this one down here, you can't really see it. It's temperance. You see cookbooks organized for AIDS research, for communal living. And I kind of knew that existed. If you're a community group and you're trying to raise money, you have your members send recipes, and then you produce a book, and then you sell it, and it makes everyone feel good because they get to share their recipes, and also you make a little bit of money. What was more surprising when we sat down with the collection and kind of or surprised me anyway, was that a lot of the cookbooks not only were raising money for the cause, but they were actually advocating for the cause within the pages of the cookbook itself. And so you had them not just as fundraisers, but in some sense as like political action or social action. And so I wanted to talk first about the suffrage cookbook. The suffrage cookbook is published in 1912, and it was published by the Western Pennsylvania the Women's Suffrage Association. And again, they published it because they were hoping to get recipes and sell the book, and the book is nicely published, as you can see. These were all the states that in fact actually had suggested that they were going to vote for an amendment for women to get the right to vote. But in the pages, it also includes photographs and recipes by prominent women's rights advocates. From the past, so that there'll be a recipe and pictures of Lucretia Mott or, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but also of more contemporary and modern suffrage leaders. So, for example, any of you read The Yellow Wallpaper? Do you know The Yellow Wallpaper? Charlotte Perkins Gilman was an important American writer and also a suffragist. And you see her recipe for how you can substitute rhubarb and apple for quince. The president of Ohio's Women's Suffrage Association gives her recipe, and it's a pretty nice one because I tried it, for creamed potatoes. So you kind of have that. But also I wanted to share this with you, which is this satirical recipe, in other words, anti-suffrage recipe for hash. And there you get something like, it's explicitly advocating on behalf of women's right to vote and also lampooning and ridiculing the argument against women's right to vote. So you really see it as actually a political argument within the pages. And the second one I wanted to share was a cookbook that I really found fascinating, the Historical Cookbook of the American Negro, which was published in 1958 by the National Council of Negro Women, which was a civil rights organization, again, designed to raise money to support civil rights, and especially focused on women of color, Black women in the United States. And they used it as a fundraiser. But again, it clearly had a broader intellectual project. In this case, maybe less, I mean, you know, obviously it's arguing for civil rights, but it also really importantly is trying to instruct its readers in Black history, which in 1958 was not something that was readily accessible in the public world. So amidst the recipes, you'll see entries describing and illustrating prominent Black leaders, writers, politicians, theologians, and also places and events. So in this particular page, you get a reference to the Southampton insurrection, or Nat Turner's rebellion. So it sort of tells us about that critical moment in Black history, and also about this man, Nat Turner, who was famous for leading at the time the largest slave a rebellion or revolution that had existed in the United States. I love the fact, I don't think there's any way that we would understand that this was Nat Turner's real recipe for crackling bread. But it is notable that Nat Turner famously was caught, captured, and then executed. That one of the things that he asked for his last meal was, in fact, actually crackling bread. And I think that the cookbook kind of references that in its pages. I think now we're going to global. Yeah, it's you.
Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about cookbooks and global events and crises. And this case features 3 different items that are considering how cookbooks both reflect and respond to times of crisis and significant historical events. And so you'll see a cookbook from World War I, World War II, and then the most recent item in the entire exhibit, which is a COVID-19 cookbook. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll just show you a couple of the items more closely that you'll see in this case. So this one here on the left, Foods That Will Win the War, was published in 1918, so during the First World War, by a couple that had worked with the then very newly established United States Food Administration. And it even took the name of the cookbook from their slogan at the time, which was "Food will win the war." And if you go to the exhibit, you'll see the posters that were used by the Food Administration, and then also were reprinted in this cookbook. And so the cookbook is really a very straightforward, practical guide about how Americans can help the war effort by their choices with cooking and eating at this time. So there wasn't the kind of rationing that happened in World War II, but there were strong encouragements. So there are recipes for how to think about eating with less meat, less white sugar, strategies for being mindful about the resources you have, being less wasteful. And so I think this is a fascinating book, and you can see it online in full on the Internet Archive if you're interested in looking through it. It's really thinking about how cooking and eating, these very kind of personal domestic acts, have consequences beyond the home. What you do inside your home can connect you to something larger and can be a patriotic act, right? So it's really a fascinating thing about thinking about how what you're having just on a daily basis within your home connects you. And the idea that kind of is so moving to me about this cookbook is that it's saying that you as an ordinary person can pitch in and do something meaningful and significant at this time of crisis. The other book has a very different take on war. This was written during World War II by MFK Fisher. That name might be familiar because she is known as one of the major food writers in the 20th century. And How to Cook a Wolf is less of a cookbook, it's more of a memoir with recipes thrown in. And Fisher is really interested in thinking about how food can be a source of solace and joy during times of hardship and crisis. So if you go to the exhibit, you'll see that we have it open. We have a scanned page of a We have a scan of a page from this cookbook that's open to the tomato soup cake recipe. And you can also, we have recipe cards, and you can pick up a recipe card for the cake if you're feeling adventurous.
Even though it doesn't sound good.
Yes. And so the idea here with this cake, as you'll look at and see in the ingredients listings, there's no frosting. It has less sugar. It's kind of a more simple, sparse cake. But Fisher really thinks that you still deserve to have cake. Even during these times of like uncertainty or crisis, it's a way to think about how to still take joy and pleasure in life, and doing so through cooking. So next is global, yes?
Yeah, global foodways. So this, the books in this collection here, and I will show them to you, really were, they were kind of designed around a question that Jolie alluded to earlier, which is, what exactly is American food? Because American food, at least in the, at the beginning of the nation, pretty much seemed like it was British food or other immigrant foods. And I think we can generally say that that has been the kind of unique thing about food in the United States, is that it tends to be constructed or built up of larger immigrant populations, what I call global foodways. And so we wanted the exhibit to kind of showcase this and the wide variety. So this first one, a cookbook I didn't even know existed, and it's such a cool cookbook, is the National Cookery Book. It was actually produced by Benjamin Franklin's great-granddaughter, and she created it and sort of organized it, the editor, I guess we would say, on behalf of the centennial of the United States in 1876 for the Philadelphia Exposition. So the book showed in the exhibition. And the thing I was really struck with by this cookbook was its both international and national focus. So on one hand, you see, and again, this is 1876, so it's really before the huge waves of immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, sort of in the beginning of the, middle of the immigration from China and Asia. But what you see in this cookbook is a remarkable number of recipes that are explicitly from these other immigrant communities. So there are recipes for kugel, there's recipes for risotto, there's recipes for dolma, and you see them kind of scattered throughout. And they're not put into a separate section, they're interlaid into the categories that even by this time are pretty standard to cookbooks, which is, main dishes, sides, desserts, etc. So I saw it as this early example of a cookbook that said, American cooking is immigrant cooking. Simultaneously, as you can see from this page here, it does something like what Amelia Simmons' cookbook did 100 years earlier, or almost 100 years earlier, which is it celebrated what was indigenous to the United States as being a part of its cuisine. And you see it in two ways. In this particular page, you see it as 7 recipes. Receipts and recipes used to be, we don't think of them now as being the same word, synonyms, but they were. Although it's a little outdated, I have to say, even by 1876 to call recipes receipts. And it's from an Oneida squaw, and indeed you have a whole chapter of recipes that are not only based on indigenous ingredients like bear or mud turtle or things like that, but also that are said to have been made by indigenous people in the United States, in this particular case from someone who is Oneida. And you also see it in a chapter, Jolie can attest to my obsession with this chapter, because it's about a 25-page chapter on things that you do with corn meal and grits. And you might think to yourself, well, there's not that many things you can do. And it's true, right? Like you make polenta, or you make, polenta, hasty pudding, these are all Indian pudding, these are all kind of the same thing, and yet we have recipes for all of them. And you really see this kind of leaning into corn as being an essential and American ingredient, and the United States eats corn, and it's healthy and it's cheap. And that's a motif that works through a lot of historical cookbooks. Oh, Aunt Babette's. I love this. You can see I love this case. Aunt Babette's cookbook is one of the first Jewish American cookbooks that was published in the United States. It's actually it's a fascinating cookbook. It's published in Cincinnati, and as I did a little research into it, it turns out it was published by a Cincinnati publishing house that was very much associated with the beginning of the Reform temples. The Block Publishing and Printing Company. It doesn't really overemphasize the fact that it's a Jewish cookbook. Maybe it's just me, but Aunt Babette doesn't like ring Jewish to me. But you do see it in the Jewish Star. But the recipes notably have unkosher food in them. There's recipes for lobster. There's even a couple times salt pork. And so it's clearly like in a Reform tradition and clearly in a kind of assimilationist mode. The page I wanted to show you is one of the things it advertises at the top is it has recipes for Easter dishes. When I first saw that, I was like, well, that's a weird thing to have in a Jewish American cookbook. When you turn to Easter dishes, they're called Easter dishes, but every single recipe is actually for Pesach, for Passover. And it's the one place in the cookbook where you see Yiddish, and the Yiddish word there is for harosets, which is the chopped apples and honey and nut mixture that you serve for Pesach. And I just found it fascinating that you really see this drive towards assimilation in this particular cookbook, in that they're saying, hey, American Jews, you want to make Passover dishes, but we're going to call them Easter dishes. But we know that our audience are Jews because we're going to give you the word for harosets, which we don't even at this point know how to transliterate, in Yiddish. So it's just a great way to kind of think about the intersections of various kinds of cuisines into what this thing we call American cooking.
You a little bit about cookbooks and local history and what cookbooks can tell us about that topic. So everything in this case is actually a community cookbook from somewhere in Ohio. And I'm assuming a lot of you are probably familiar with community cookbooks, but just in case, I'll give you a little bit of an overview. So they really got their start in late 19th century America, and they're kind of an amazingly, distinctly American phenomenon. While they happen a little bit in Canada and England, they really, really take off here in the US, and as you all probably know, are kind of ubiquitous throughout much of the 20th century. They're just everywhere. And these often we call them spiral or comb bound, like very DIY looking cookbooks put together by local groups, women's clubs, charities, with the idea that they're going to be fundraisers. Maybe the church needs a new roof or something like that, right? And I think the idea here, and why it was so successful and pervasive, is everyone has a recipe, right? If you want to think about how to raise funds, how to put together a project or a book, what can you fill that book with? You can fill it with recipes that all of your community members have a particular dish that they're known for, that they love, that they'd like to share. So this is what makes up community cookbooks. And so when you look at the case, you'll see a few different examples. Some are more, as you can see, DIY than others. These are both from the 1970s. And I love these just because you can see how thoroughly local they are, right? As the 20th century went on, some local groups sent their send their recipes off to like small cookbook publishers to have them put together these projects. Others chose a different route and really did all that work themselves. And you can kind of see that these are made with what is available on hand, like available like local materials and resources. Ohio family favorites. The covers are like kind of like cardstock scrap paper. They actually don't have any printing on either side. It kind of feels like maybe somebody found it like available. And then I love this one too. You can see the binding is unconventional for both, right? This one has yarn and this one has metal clips, maybe because this was what was available for the binding. So these cookbooks are really fascinating for, I'll tell you just a few of my favorite reasons. One is you can learn a lot about local history and genealogy if you're doing research on a particular area or region. Obviously, people are submitting recipes and they have their names with them, so you can like research potentially your family or your neighbors. I grew up in a small area in Missouri and collect community cookbooks from where I grew up. And this is kind of an amazing resource because there's not a lot written or published about the history of that area. And that's one of the other things I love about community cookbooks, especially for small or rural communities where there's not a lot of documentation. You can find out a lot about a particular group or an area through the cookbook itself. Another thing I really love about these cookbooks is more than like the published mainstream cookbooks that we've been looking at, community cookbooks usually feature recipes that we have a better sense that they were actually made. They were cooked. They're not theoretical things that appear in a published cookbook that somebody might have looked at and thought, that looks cool, but too much work. These are things that were like loved and made over and over. So we can really get a sense of how people really ate in a particular area, what dishes were maybe common or popular. And you'll see when you go into the exhibit, this case features a cookbook that's open to Columbus cookbook that's open to a page about Johnny Marzetti, the sort of like iconic Columbus dish. No, I'm gonna hand it back over to you, I think.
Cookbooks and technological innovation, which probably can be best described as the opposite of local cookbooks. It's fine. One of the things I realized, I think we both realized, is that so many cookbooks, especially starting in around the 1920s, were created to sell either new technologies for cooking or new ingredients. So it was just like a remarkable marketing tool, both cookbooks and then also recipe cards. And so here are just some of the examples that are in the exhibit. You see both one of the Jewel Steel Range cookbook, which was when there was actually coal-burning stoves brought into households, and all of a sudden you didn't have to have a wood fire, which meant cooking could be much more precise. And every single year, this company and many other stove companies would, in fact, send out a cookbook, again, to market it. Wouldn't you like to be able to make this dish? Well, then buy the Jewel Steel stove. And then the microwave cookbook, which, as a child, again, of the 70s, again, my mom actually had this cookbook, although not this little pocket size. I have no idea why anyone would want a pocket size cookbook. This makes a purse size. This makes no sense to me, but in any case, essentially, those of you, and we know that even today, why should I get an Instant Pot? Well, let me tell you, by giving you a cookbook that tells you what you can make in it. But you also see it in ingredients. Baking powder was an American invention. It's still almost impossible to get in various European nations, which still use a combination of baking soda and cream of tartar. Jell-O, there's an American food. The history of Jell-O is fascinating. Jolie went to their museum. And again, there are so many cookbooks that Jell-O presented because it was this new, remarkable thing. And I don't know if you know this about Jell-O, but it was understood as like a democratic food because Jell-O molds were very hard, right? In order to make Jell-O, before there was instant Jell-O, you had to boil down, I hope you knew this, horse hooves, collagen, to in fact act. And then once you had that, you still had to wait incredible amounts of time to let it set. So the understanding was that Jell-O molds, things in Jell-O, were rich people dishes. And so with the invention of Jell-O, and actually I'll turn to this, and the refrigerator, all of a sudden, Jell-O could be something that anyone could make. You didn't have to have a 10-person servant staff to serve it at the meal. This is I love this cookbook that GE put out in, I think, I wrote down the date, I think it's 1922, something around then, to sell refrigerators. And one of the things that's kind of great about it is that almost all the recipes are these like Jell-O molds or salads, because I think the understanding was, like, why do you need a refrigerator? Like, the icebox is fine, so they have to make a case for why it is that refrigerators are incredibly important for even, ordinary cookers. The other thing that's kind of great about, it doesn't have her name, is that GE got a famous cookbook writer who had actually studied with Fannie Farmer at the Boston Cooking School, at the Boston Cooking School, to write the cookbook. So it wasn't just like any old cookbook. It was actually a prestigious cook, domestic arts cooker that was writing the recipes, proving to you that you couldn't be a really good housewife unless you had a refrigerator. If you come to the show, then you'll get to see these great pictures. They're not here, but that crack me up, of like these couples wearing like evening gowns and tuxedos, standing in front of their open refrigerator, and like eating food, because now this is how you can entertain. You just take people into the kitchen and show them your refrigerator and eat cold Jell-O salads.
You a little bit about cookbooks and personal histories. And I'm gonna, actually, we can go ahead and go, I should have clicked to the next slide. Okay, so thinking about personal histories in two different ways in this case. And one is cookbooks as memoirs. And I think this is a really common concept today. If you're following cookbooks as they're currently coming out, this is like a huge trend, and it feels like, well, yeah, obviously, cookbooks can be personal stories. Historically, when you look at cookbooks, this is kind of a less common thing. One of the earliest versions that we wanted to share and highlight in this case is Spoon Bread and Strawberry Wine by Norma Jean and Carol Darden. These were two sisters who wrote a cookbook with personal stories, family histories. They spent several years traveling around, conducting oral histories, doing genealogical research, trying to really learn the roots of their family and their history. And the cookbook is really a fascinating document. It's organized so each chapter is about a different family member, and it includes photos of them and like personal stories, but then also recipes that are relevant to these individuals. And so this is just really an interesting example of cookbook as memoir, but it also is, I think, doing something larger because it's documenting African-American foodways and traditions and histories. And this was back in the 70s. So they were like way ahead of their time. One of the other ways to think about cookbooks and personal stories in this case is I'm convinced, Beth has heard me say this many times, that people write in their cookbooks like more than any other kind of books. Whether it's like, you've got to fix that recipe and modify it so you know how to make it the way you want to make it next time, or maybe you're writing recipes from other sources into that cookbook because it's a reference you use a lot. So cookbooks through time and interaction become these like personal, precious objects. And that's what you see here. This is a cookbook that belonged to George Bellows. I'm guessing many of you are familiar with him. So he was from Columbus, attended Ohio State, went on to be one of the most famous painters of the 20th century. And you can obviously see some of his works at the Columbus Museum of Art. But when he still lived in Columbus, and we know this is from his Columbus days because his address in downtown is actually written in the front of the book. But this is his personal cookbook that almost every other page is written with like recipes or notes, his excursions of camping or duck hunting. He's clipped out newspaper articles and put them in, usually related to hunting, fishing, something like that. So you can see through sort of like the time and use and effort that this goes from being like a mass-marketed object to something very personal and precious and unique to that individual. I think we're going to head on to the last case. So you can see this is also personal histories, but this is a little different. The final case in the exhibit is actually thinking about like what else beyond cookbooks, because cookbooks are just one way people have thought to document and share recipes throughout time, right? So what you'll see when you look at this case is the different kinds of modes people have used to collect, organize, and preserve their recipe collections. And the earliest examples are some 19th century manuscript cookbooks. These are really, really interesting. So you see one here and then over there. These are handwritten recipe collections. This was very common throughout most of history until the last 100 years or so, where people would write their own recipe collections, own recipes, maybe from like recipes from friends, neighbors, family, maybe even other printed sources, and keep a book of them as a reference, maybe instead of or in addition to having their own cookbook collection. So this is sort of the earliest iteration, but you see sort of like the things that came after the manuscript cookbook in this case as well. So the next iteration is, you can go on to the next slide, thanks. So this is gonna look much more familiar, I think, is the recipe box. And this is like, you know, something that takes off in the early 20th century and is still kind of around. I think we ended up talking to a lot of students when we had this exhibit at the library, and they even recognize this, even if they don't have their own recipe boxes. This is still a very familiar concept. And so this is one of my favorite items in the exhibit, in part because this is actually, we don't know the name of the person who maintained this box, but this is somebody who lived in central Ohio. And we know that because there are clippings from the Columbus Dispatch. There's a recipe for a pie from Lazarus. So this is a very, very local creation. And you can see with some of the little cards scattered that they're collecting from lots of different sources, right? Some of them are typed up or printed. Some of them are from like packaging of like food packaging or cut out from newspapers. And I think this speaks to this idea of, you know, we think of information overload today as like a very like new common problem, but it's not, right? Like people were trying to manage this decades ago, having access to more recipes from more different sources than ever, and thinking about how to like make sure you actually are able to collect all of those and organize them. And I think this is a slightly better version than like writing them all out in a book, right? You can individually take out the recipe cards, and it's like easier to find and organize and store them, I think. And then the last example you'll see in that case is, I think maybe the most current version of that we have in the collections, which again is a local Columbus resident from the late 20th, early 21st century, a recipe binder. And again, this is kind of building off this idea of like how to improve on collecting and organizing recipes. And you can imagine with a binder, you're seeing a lot of recipes at once, and they're protected, so the food isn't gonna spill on the recipe cards. So again, thinking about how to kind of like collect and preserve your recipes and updating that as we go on throughout the 20th century. I'll point out one other thing. I'll point out one other thing about that you'll see if you go to that the exhibit and look at that case. That is like really that is really amazing about all the different recipe collections. Is all of these different people whether it's through manuscript cookbooks, binders, recipe boxes, they're all really interested in thinking about how to cite their sources. There are names written on the different things of like, I got the donuts from Mrs. Rael, or these are Mom's biscuits, or this particular person gave me this pie recipe. So you can see like a personal social network here. And I think we probably, many of us have that experience of thinking about making sure that we know where we got this recipe, because it's not just a recipe, it's about that relationship that we have with the individual. So it's creating this document beyond just like a collection of recipes. Okay, we can go on now.
I was thinking about in that when Jolie got the index the recipe what's the
Recipe
word?
box.
Box, thank you. One of the things she found in it was called, it was Murray Beja's, it was a recipe for a cocktail, wasn't it? It was like a whiskey sour or something like that. Murray Beja was a chair in the English department. I think he started as chair in the 1970s. He retired in 2002, just as I was coming here. And it had been printed in the Dispatch, but it said that it was the recipe of Morris Beja. And that itself was like so, and I wrote him and I was like, do you remember this?
I didn't know you.
Oh yeah, and he's like, I didn't know it was in the Dispatch, but when people came over, I always would make this cocktail because people loved it. And it was just like, it was so amazing that Jolie happened to buy this box and it happened to have this index card, and the index card happened to have a recipe from someone that I knew, and I was able to reach out to him, and it also had been in the Dispatch. And I think that sense of like interconnection is what is so remarkable about cookbooks as a genre, as a textual genre.
Okay, last slide, trying to be mindful of time.
Yes.
So we just wanted to wrap up by encouraging you to check out the exhibit if you're able to do so. So we have the dates here. I will also say if you are inclined, you can scan that QR code and it goes to a digital exhibit that you'll see. So you'll actually see much more than you'll see in the exhibit, because we were able to include like more images of things, and there are links to books that are out of copyright, so you can like actually read them in full, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. I will also say before we wrap up, and so I had mentioned that I oversee and I'm actively developing the cookbook collection. I help researchers and students. I just want you all to know that our collections are open to anyone. So if you are at all interested in coming in to use materials, feel free to ask me afterwards and we can chat. I'm happy to help you use the materials that we have.
It's a really nice space. Some research libraries or book libraries make you feel like you shouldn't be there, but that's not the case at OSU. It's very nice. Well, thank you for coming, and we'd be happy to answer questions if there's time.
Yep.
Kind of a two-parter, but what that you were sharing this really cool connection that you found at the end. What have you found any, like, were there any favorite cookbooks or favorite recipes or just like favorite pieces of information that you found while curating?
They're all our favorites. How do we answer?
Or
Yeah.
something that you just stood out as like, oh, this is
I mean, I will say the Aunt Babette's cookbook was like a really cool. I have to say, as a researcher, and I'm very sad that I'm chair because I have much less time. I want to do so many projects. I am fascinated by that publishing house. I would love to go back and look at that. I became obsessed with Johnny Marzetti. Because of the as Jolie said, one of the cookbooks has several recipes for Johnny Marzetti, and so I did some is that in the notebooks at the exhibit? Is the Johnny Marzetti recipe on the? Did we use that one?
You too can have your own Johnny Marzetti recipe.
And I want you to know that the Johnny Marzetti recipe is actually not from a cookbook, but from the Ohio Historical Society, which has Mrs. Marzetti's original recipe. In doing the research, I found out that it's actually understood as a national dish of Panama, because the dish spread from Ohio schools to the Army to Panama. So many cool. It's hard. Those are two that come to mind, but honestly, they were all our favorites. It was like asking a favorite child.
I think we also made a point of picking, like everything we just shared with you were like some of our favorites. We're kind of thinking about the presentation that way as well.
If you're studying cookbooks and the rise of blogging and like YouTube, how do you see cookbooks changing with the rise of these new technologies?
So the question was, how do we see cookbooks changing with the rise of new technologies? And that is an essay question, isn't it?
I mean, one of the things is we would ask students. We took a lot of student groups on the exhibit when it was at Thompson Library, and we would always ask, "Do you have cookbooks?" And it was interesting because they always did. But then we would, they'd have cookbooks, or sometimes like their families had produced cookbooks that they shared, or recipe cards that they shared. But when we said, "What do you cook from?" They almost always said either food blogs or TikTok or
ChatGPT.
Really,
Yes.
ChatGPT. I mean, it's not too surprising, right? It would just gather the data, and I do think like new technologies of cookbook organization are really important. I know, again, my mom, when we first got our first personal computer, which was in we were really early, but when we first got our first Macintosh, which was in '88, it had HyperCard. I don't know if any of you remember HyperCard. And she was like, "I'm going to take all my recipes and I'm going to plug them into HyperCard, and then that's going to be our new recipe book." Ultimately, Apple let HyperCard go, and so then she had to print out all of them and put her in her binder. And I do think I think it's a little bit like, what's a good, reliable technology? Paper, books, print, because you know that it's never going to go away. That's why we're reading from this and not the.
I think just to build off of that, I think the ways people can find recipes is continuing to expand, and the ways that people store their collections. But you probably know, if you go to Barnes & Noble, there's an infinite number of new cookbooks all the time. Cookbook sales are up in a time when like print books are kind of like, there's not necessarily a good, reliable industry there. So I don't think that even though there's more stuff, that's going to, I don't think there's any fear of cookbooks going away.
You mentioned that the OSU collection had nearly 10,000 volumes of cookbooks. What was the process like of selecting one for the exhibit?
Of selecting for the exhibit? Oh gosh. Well, my starting point was, as I mentioned at the beginning, that I had taught for the past several years with the cookbooks. So we have classes come in and do like instructional sessions. And then after having done that a lot, I thought, there's more here to do with cookbooks. So I taught a first-year seminar where we just worked the entire semester with the cookbooks. So that gave me a really good sense of like what we had. Having said that, it's like I probably worked with a few hundred cookbooks, not 10,000. So I think Beth and I thought about kind of like the topics we wanted to think about and started to explore from there because 10,000 cookbooks was too much otherwise.
Yeah, I remember we would start off with maybe for each topic, we'd have like 50 books. We'd have these big carts, and then we would essentially just look at them and just narrow them down, and like have little fisticuffs, like, no, I need it. That was.
And a lot of that was based on, there's like, in the last couple of decades, there's just been such an incredible explosion of really fantastic writing about cookbook history, food studies. So we were able to kind of draw on that, thinking about like, what are the important cookbooks we might want to look at and know about?
Yeah, we were able to use that historical research to help us.
So the question was, do we have any recommendations for reading about cookbooks further? Yes?
I wish I had my bibliography in my head. I'm going to give you my card afterwards, and then you write me, and I will give you some good titles that we use. There's some good. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
There. Bibliography?
Yes, there's a bibliography on the digital exhibit. So we have like the top, I think it's like 10 or 12 books that we consulted the most that are like really amazing and very accessible. They're not necessarily like, you should be able to find them still in print. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where is the arts in Ohio?
Go ahead.
It's in Lanes. Downtown.
So the question was, where's the Decorative Arts Center? Not very far, Lancaster, Ohio. Yes.
So many questions. First of all, what are like the top 3 recipes you saw over and over and over again as you were consulting these cookbooks? Or top 3? Or variations
Of the. Well, one of the things that we did see a lot of, but partially because we were looking for it, is we wanted to in the original exhibit, and it is the pie wall.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the pie
Oh,
wall.
yeah.
So, and also at the new exhibit is that we wanted, it's historical. We've attacked, from 18. Our edition.
It's not in the Decorative Arts Museum, though.
It's not in the decorative. Okay, but I can still say it.
Yes.
We wanted to. Of the pies, yeah, that's what, yeah,
okay.
yeah. So we wanted to think about how recipes were the same. Like, there are only so many ways you can make something like apple pie. But also that the ingredients and also the syntax of recipes changed over time. So we picked apple pie as the way to do it. So there's a recipe where it's always crust. The crust is made out of flour and some sort of fat, and the apples. But there are differences. So that, for example, the flavoring of a lot of earlier apple pies are more, I guess you could say, more adventurous. There's like rose water. Doesn't sound very good to me, but rose water or other kinds of spicing, as opposed to what then becomes really standardized: clove, nutmeg, cinnamon. I grew up, I always made my apple pies with raw apples. That's just how I thought everyone made pies. Not correct. Lots of people make pies with cooked apples, and you see that kind of like playing out in the recipes. So that apple pie was one. What else can you think of? Soups. A lot of soups you see a lot of soup recipes, consommes, bouillons. I saw those a lot.
I almost feel like it's hard to say overall because we're trying to capture 200 years. So if you look by particular decades or eras, you can definitely see trends, but I think that is why we went with apple pie because that is like a really clear, consistent thing throughout like the entire history. But lots of other things just kind of come and go.
Do you have the strangest recipe that you came across? Something that caught your eye that you're like, oh, that's interesting.
Jello.
I feel like I've been stumped.
I know. I'm trying to figure out was there anything that just like. I'm a pretty adventurous eater, so I think I was really trying. Did you come up with one?
Well, I feel like this may not be a surprise, but the community cookbooks,
Yeah.
because they are such DIY projects and have no like editor who's like, nobody's going to eat that, will have stuff that you kind of might be like, And I think we saw a lot of that, but I don't know if I can pull anything up right now.
I'm not sure if we made anything. There was a cookbook I found that I thought was what was it called? I'm not sure it's in our exhibit, but it was in the original exhibit, which was the Kosher Chinese Cookbook. And that was just a really wild cookbook to me. And like, so one of the recipes is, it's matzo brie fu young. And I was like, well, that's just a little weird. But I tried it, and I got to say, like, it turns out like eggs, matzah, bok choy, onions, like that's a good combo. So I kind of, my motto was like, you know what? It's probably okay. Maybe a little bland, but usually not too bad.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for coming.